Alphas are biologically hardwired to repel each other. Yet, I spent years pining after Ken Lancaster, a fellow alpha. When the Lancaster family faced financial ruin, I threw money at the problem to pull them through. But I took advantage of their desperation, attaching a condition to the bailout. Ken had to marry me. Years of delusion became reality overnight. But even after plucking the moon from the sky, I didn't dare taint it. I treated Ken like something sacred, untouchable. Yet, when he found out I'd sought out a high-matching omega to soothe my pheromone disorder, he tore off his mask and chained me inside the bedroom. You like omegas? Then I'll just have to work harder and turn you into my omega, won't I? At the stroke of midnight, the phone on the table lit up with a notification. Wedding anniversary. I rolled the dice, casually tapped the screen off, and shoved the phone back into my pocket. A faint scent drifted past my nose. My thoughts snapped back to the present as a pretty, docile omega leaned in, lifting a wine glass to my lips. I realized I'd lost this round. I had to drink. I drank from the boy's hand, then tilted my head slightly to dodge his next move. Just then, the door to the VIP lounge swung open. I looked up. The newcomer stood tall and elegant, smiling as he chatted with the birthday boy who had rushed over to greet him. The shifting lights traced his perfect profile, noble, beautiful, and eye-catching. It was Ken Lancaster, my husband in name only, whom I hadn't seen in days. Since childhood, Ken had been the center of everyone's universe. Even when he hit rock bottom, plenty of people wanted to help him. I was just the one who got lucky and bought my way in. As he spoke to the others, his gaze seemed to drift past the crowd, shifting an inch toward me, though it mostly landed on the boy beside me. Stung by that look, I snapped out of it and shifted forward slightly, blocking the boy from view. Married for 2 years, we had a tacit agreement to maintain a sham marriage and stay out of each other's way. I could tolerate his polite distance toward me, but I couldn't stand seeing him look at anyone else. Ken had been out of town on business lately. According to his schedule, he wasn't supposed to be back in New York until tomorrow afternoon. Yet here he was, looking travel-worn and rushing in. Before I could think too much about it, the door opened again. Sorry, flight was delayed. I'm late. I followed the voice and saw a familiar figure. My brain buzzed, and my hand, reaching for my glass, froze in mid-air. No wonder Ken, usually a workaholic, had suddenly changed his itinerary and rushed back to the city. Today was the day his first love, Felix, returned from abroad. Felix quickly became the new center of attention, surrounded by the crowd alongside Ken. The pretty, accomplished Omega had shed his youthful awkwardness and grown even more stunning. Standing next to Ken, whose profile was only partially visible, they looked like a perfect match. The two of them sat down on the other side of the room. I looked away and downed my second drink of the night. The Omega beside me saw this and eagerly poured me another. I finally took a good look at him, soft, chestnut-colored short hair, a small, pretty face. His movements were ingratiating but not fawning. Definitely more likable than an alpha. Sam seems to have a soft spot for this Omega tonight. Huh? Someone teased, unaware of my relationship with Ken. The voice wasn't loud, but it drew several pairs of eyes. I took a sip of wine and commented calmly, "He's quick and knows how to read the room." "Turn off the CEO mode," my friend laughed from the side. "Is he interviewing for a job here?" I smiled but didn't answer, and the topic shifted quickly. As my gaze wandered, I accidentally locked eyes with Ken. His expression was flat and emotionless. For no reason at all, my heart panicked. When the party broke up, Ken and Felix left side by side. A reunion of old flames meant they naturally had a lot of catching up to do. I laughed at myself, mocking my own misery, and walked unsteadily in the opposite direction. The Omega from earlier trailed after me, hesitant and shy. I stopped and told him concisely that I had no extra intentions toward him. The kid, who should have taken the hint and left, somehow found the courage to persist. "Mr. Sterling, I can be very obedient in other ways, too." The slight buzz from the alcohol made my thoughts sluggish. I stared blankly for a moment before I understood the implication. I frowned. Just as I was about to refuse him again, Ken walked around the corner. His expression was distant, but his tone carried a cold edge. "What, is Mr. Sterling planning to stay the night?" "Mr. Sterling?" The subtle joy of seeing Ken return was crushed by the formal address. I shook my head. No. Walk together, then? Hard to get a driver at this hour. Walk together? I paused, and without thinking, asked the question burning in my mind. Where's Felix? Ken frowned slightly, seemingly confused, but answered truthfully, I just had the driver take him home. Right? With his moral standards, he wouldn't cheat while married. But you're driving yourself? I was puzzled. You didn't drink? No. He gave a smile I couldn't interpret. I don't have anyone waiting on me hand and foot to feed me alcohol. Flustered by that smile, my head felt a little dizzier. I didn't dig into his unusual behavior. Instinctively, I followed him out of the club. The moment I got into the car, I was enveloped by a familiar pheromone. Maybe it was the alcohol, but I allowed myself to indulge in the scent for a moment. Do you remember what day it is? Ken asked suddenly. Thinking he was testing my sobriety, I paused and answered, Ethan's birthday. As soon as the words left my mouth, the faint layer of pheromones in the air suddenly turned aggressive. My body stiffened at the spike. Was he trying to brag that his white moonlight had returned today? I was about to ask, but Ken turned slightly away, making it clear he didn't want to talk to me anymore. My heart soured. Suddenly, the notification from earlier popped into my mind. Today was actually our second wedding anniversary, if you counted from this moment. The ride was silent. When we got home, we went to our separate rooms. Because of our different schedules and the biological repulsion between alphas, I had suggested sleeping in separate rooms after the wedding. At the time, Ken had looked at me quietly for a while before accepting the proposal with indifference. For the past 2 years, although we lived together, we were more like nodding neighbors. I washed up and had just lain down when there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Ken standing there in his loungewear, holding a bowl. The hallway light spilled softly over him, adding a tenderness I rarely saw. I made you some hangover tea. Careful or you'll have a headache in the morning. The man before me looked like an illusion from a dream. His soft voice sounded like a siren's lure. I reached out and took it, holding it in a daze. Thanks. Ken's lips curved. Aren't you going to drink it while it's warm? Oh, right. I snapped out of it and obediently drank the tea in one go. Ken took the empty bowl. The smile in his eyes seemed to deepen with meaning. Good boy. My mind went blank at the praise. By the time I recovered, Ken was already walking away. He was so considerate and responsible even to a partner in name only. I lay back in bed, comparing Ken's kindness with my own villainous behavior. It was unbearable and torturous. But before I could dwell on it, my vision blurred, and I drifted into a groggy sleep. In the drift of consciousness, I dreamed of the past. In high school, Ken had excellent grades and stood out in every way. Wherever he went, he was the center of attention. As the eternal runner-up living in his shadow, my parents constantly compared me to him. After hearing it enough times, I started to care. My eyes began to follow him subconsciously. I looked up at him for so long that, without realizing when it started, I became just another one of his admirers. We had both presented as alphas by then. I knew there was no future between two alphas. Besides, he had Felix. Their families were equal in status, they shared interests, and they looked perfect together. I heard their pheromone compatibility was incredibly high, too. A match made in heaven. So, I only watched him from a distance, never daring to cross the line. After graduation, the little contact we had was completely cut off. When we met again, the favored son of heaven had fallen from grace, and his lover was nowhere to be found. Some mocked him, others offered help. I was undoubtedly the greediest of the latter group. Using the financial aid to his family as leverage, I forced him to marry me. A pervert who liked his own kind, greedy enough to drag him into the abyss. With me, truly, shameless. Still immersed in the past, I vaguely felt someone lift my blanket. The person buried their face in the crook of my neck, seemingly sniffing my scent. Warm breath dusted against my skin. Tickled. I moved uncomfortably. The person pinned my wrists, tilted their head slightly, and gave me a warning nip. The scent lingering in my nose was familiar, unmistakably alpha pheromones. Yet it made me uncontrollably dizzy. Subconsciously, I submitted to him. His movements were frivolous, like he was playing with a toy. I couldn't catch my breath, but it felt so good that I couldn't help but let out a soft moan. Sensing the change in my body, the person chuckled. You're so sensitive to my touch. Do you really have feelings for omegas? The dream was absurd yet vivid, but because of who starred in it, I couldn't help sinking deeper. I woke up. I rubbed my throbbing temples and grabbed my phone to check the time. It was already 11 a.m. The strict biological clock I'd maintained since I was a teenager had somehow failed today. After a quick wash, I went downstairs, planning to get something to eat. As soon as I reached the landing, I saw Ken standing in the middle of the living room, looking down as he adjusted his watch. I blinked slowly, trying to determine if this was a hallucination. Seeming to sense me, Ken looked up. Awake, meeting his gaze, I nervously tugged at the hem of my pajamas. Yeah. After the brief exchange, the atmosphere froze again. Have something to take care of. I'm heading out. Ken spoke again. The joy of seeing him at home was slowly washed away. Even though there was no chance we'd celebrate a so-called anniversary, just staying in the same house with him on this special day would have been enough to make me secretly happy for a long time. But my expectations always seemed to fall flat. I wanted to call out to him, but I didn't know what excuse or standing I had. So I could only reply dryly, okay. Watching his retreating back, I forced myself to suppress the bitterness in my heart. Don't push your luck. Don't have expectations. I warned myself once again. I lost my appetite for breakfast, and I didn't have a habit of going back to sleep. I sat on the sofa, staring blankly into space. The dizziness from earlier crept back up. My vision blurred, and my body felt like it was on fire, probably a high fever. I suffered from severe pheromone disorder. Fevers like this were a common occurrence for me. I dug out my meds and took 2 pills, but for some reason, they weren't as effective as usual. After taking a triple dose with no improvement, I called my best friend and doctor, Chris. He rushed over, found me passed out in the living room, and took me to the hospital. I didn't know how long passed before I woke up again. Seeing me awake, Chris leaned in to check my forehead. Memories from before I passed out surfaced, and I thanked him. Taking that many pills at once. I'm surprised you had the strength. To call me, he sneered. Next time, just call the funeral home directly. Saves time on the paperwork. I curled my lips into a smile. Got a recommendation? He rolled his eyes. No jokes. If you keep dragging this out, I can't guarantee you'll live past 30. I did the math in my head. Maybe before I hit 30, this sham marriage with Ken would reach its end anyway. That's fine, I said lightly. Less suffering for a couple of years. Chris dropped his smile, grabbed my collar, and gritted his teeth. What the hell are you talking about? After shouting, he paused, straightened up, and asked out of nowhere. Sam, I heard Felix is back? My throat felt dry. Yeah. Chris hesitated, then spoke slowly. If those two get back together, could you think about yourself for once? Please? Even my best friend thought they would get back together. A dull ache throbbed in my chest. I steadied myself, lowered my eyes, and listened. I know Chris, don't mean much to you, Sam Sterling. I'm not important enough to make you stay. But even if I beg you, can you have a little bit, just a little bit of pity for yourself? I put away the fake relaxed smile on my face. I sighed. Chris, you've been my best friend for years. Don't say you don't mean much. After a long silence, I compromised. Fine. I accept your treatment plan. I had to stay alive to talk about the future. Seeing Chris become visibly ecstatic because of my answer, I started to think this was probably the right decision. As if afraid I'd change my mind, Chris quickly arranged a meeting with a high-compatibility Omega for me. The Omega walked with a gentle, elegant grace. He was slender as bamboo, with a calm face and eyes that turned up slightly at the corners, holding a faint smile. When he got close, he introduced himself. Mr. Sterling, hello.
I'm Wesley.
Neither humble nor arrogant. His gentle temperament hid a hint of pride born from high status. I quietly sized him up and replied, pleasure. Someone like this obviously wasn't agreeing to treat me for money. Having someone with unknown motives know about my hidden illness. My eyelid twitched. What a huge headache. I shot a glance at Chris. Chris clearly understood my concern and coughed guiltily. Let's test first. After a simple test, we started discussing the treatment details. The treatment was broad, mainly requiring soothing from omega pheromones. This included but wasn't limited to hugging, kissing, or even marking. Wesley smiled faintly. I can accept anything. It depends on Mr. Sterling's needs. I chuckled lightly. No marking. Just simple physical contact for therapy. As for payment, I tapped the side of my cup. Mr. Wesley, please speak frankly. I never liked beating around the bush. Felix is back, Wesley said without coyness. I want to borrow Mr. Sterling's influence to keep my foothold in the Fong family so I don't get kicked out. Then I remembered. He was the stepson of the Fong family, Felix's stepbrother. Rumor had it the brothers didn't get along. No wonder he was worried. Felix came back and latched onto Ken, while his brother sought me out. Truly very interesting. I lowered my eyes, took a sip of tea, and agreed. After settling everything, I drove Wesley home before heading back to my own place. It was nearly midnight when I got home. I wasn't sure if Ken was back yet, but knowing his usual habits, I moved quietly. I changed into slippers and walked softly inside. When I turned on the living room light, the scene before me made me falter. The person occupying my thoughts was leaning against the sofa, still in his clothes from earlier. It overlapped with the scene from this morning. The only difference seemed to be the shift from day to night, as if he had been there the whole time, never leaving. There was one difference, a large bouquet of roses at his feet. The flowers were no longer fresh. They were starting to wilt. Received hours ago, probably. I stood frozen, making deductions in my mind. He turned his head, glanced at me and asked, "Back?" I nodded, trying my best to ignore the ambiguous roses, and answered briefly as usual, "Yeah, I'm going upstairs." But inside, I couldn't stop guessing who he met today. Was it Sean? Afraid I'd lose my composure, I tried to walk upstairs quickly, almost fleeing the scene.
I'm curious.
What kind of work keeps the CEO busy until this late on a weekend? Ken asked an unusually probing question. I couldn't ignore him, but I wouldn't admit I went to the hospital. So I answered, not work. Meeting a friend. He stood up and leaned in slightly, as if trying to discern something. After a long moment, he asked, a very important friend? He was acting increasingly strange today, but I nodded along with his question. Ken let out a short laugh, a flicker of anger passing through his eyes. Without another word, he turned and stormed upstairs. I suppressed my confusion and followed him to my room. In my sleep, the strange dream from the night before returned. Only this time, the actions were fiercer, carrying a hint of punishment. You smell like a stranger's omega. I'm actually very curious. When did you get such an important friend? When I woke up, a quiet message sat in my pinned chat. Business trip. Back in 3 days. A very formulaic report. Someone seeing the chat log might think we were colleagues. In reality, our relationship wasn't much closer than that. Lately, Ken had been getting busier, his business trips increasing exponentially. The last time we met was at my friend's birthday party, nearly a month ago. Looking at the message again, I suddenly wondered, was he working this hard to get rid of me? Back when the Lancaster family business was on the brink of bankruptcy, it barely survived thanks to my capital and cooperation. Now, barely 2 years after Ken took over, it was showing signs of returning to its former glory. This relationship sustained by money was probably nearing its end. As I was thinking, Chris sent me a picture, a screenshot of Felix's social feed. Came to complain to uncle and auntie. Ken's been overworking me, but now he'll have to behave. The photo showed him eating with the Lancaster family. The dishes on the table were lavish, a treatment I had never received. Right after we got married, Ken had taken me to the Lancaster home out of politeness. At the dinner table, although his parents didn't show it openly, I could feel their dislike. As we were leaving, I accidentally overheard Ken's mother asking if he planned to divorce. Ken answered calmly, "I'll consider it once the company is stable." Good, his mother relaxed, then added, "Sigh, he did help our family after all. Remember to compensate him well when the time comes." I will. I didn't want compensation. I wanted Ken's love. But that thought was likely a delusion for this lifetime. That day, I fled in disgrace. After that, whenever holidays came around, I used work as an excuse and never went to the Lancaster home again. Drawing my thoughts back, I looked down at the photo on my phone. The group looked lively and warm sitting together. Even Ken, who always gave me the cold shoulder, had a faint smile in his eyes. Chris immediately followed up, "Just a heads up. They're meeting the parents. These two might be getting back together. Cut your losses, man." Cut my losses? I always seemed to be pushing for more, but cutting my losses seemed like the better option now. Looking at the happy group in the photo for the first time in 2 years of marriage, I had the thought of divorce. Before, I wanted to drag this out until the day Ken wanted to end it. Now, I wanted to leave myself a shred of dignity. I wasn't one to procrastinate. Once the idea took root, I immediately contacted a lawyer to draft a divorce agreement. In the afternoon, I sent the electronic draft to Ken. I had a lawyer draft a divorce agreement. Please look it over. If you have any additional conditions, state them directly. If there are no issues, I'll mail the hard copy. Please take a moment to sign it. I had been forcing myself to stay spirited all day. After sending the message, I lay back on the bed, exhausted, waiting for a reply. But hours passed, and Ken didn't respond. Probably with his beauty by his side, too busy to care. I turned off my phone, planning to sleep, but my heat cycle hit suddenly, fast and ferocious. I messaged Chris, telling him to move up the treatment. Then, forcing myself to stay conscious, I threw on a coat and rushed out. Chris was quick. He arranged everything in no time. Technically, in my condition, I shouldn't have gone out. But I didn't want to bring anyone to my house. Chris couldn't talk me out of it, so he just resigned himself to reminding me to take suppressive measures. To avoid any accidents on the way, the treatment location was set near my place. Even so, when I arrived, the two of them had clearly been waiting for a while. "Sorry to keep you wait, enough. Chris stepped forward to support me. "You're half dead and still apologizing?" He quickly gave me a suppressant injection while Wesley silently released pheromones to soothe me. Chris looked like he wanted to say something but stopped. Finally, he instructed, "If it's really bad, make some contact. Don't tough it out." I nodded. After giving his instructions, Chris left the room. I fought the alpha instinct to react to a high-compatibility omega, trying my hardest to suppress the agitation. Seeing this, Wesley spoke slowly. "I can accept a temporary mark." I shook my head. "No need." He smiled knowingly. "Mr. Sterling really keeps himself clean." I admit, refusing to touch Wesley even at this moment was partly out of consideration for Ken. But that was just out of respect for a marital partner. As for Ken himself, he probably wouldn't care at all. I closed my eyes and didn't reply. About half an hour later, the pheromones in my body gradually stabilized. Chris grumpily gave me a list of precautions, then left without looking back. I put on my inhibitor bracelet and walked out the door. Downstairs, I saw Wesley, who had left with Chris earlier, standing by the road, clearly waiting for me. "Something wrong?" I didn't stop walking. Wesley smiled. "I wanted to talk to Mr. Sterling about payment." "What do you need me to do?" "The Fong family is hosting a gala next week. I hope Mr. Sterling can attend as my partner." Next week. Ken had probably read the divorce agreement by now. By then, our marriage should be dissolved. Thinking of this, I nodded and agreed. Wesley thanked me, got in his car, and left. It was only a short distance to my house, so I chose to walk. The cool evening breeze brushed my face, blowing away the summer heat, but it couldn't ease the dull ache in my heart. As I neared my front door, my steps faltered. The person occupying my every thought suddenly appeared right in front of me. Ken said nothing, just stared at me dead on. My heart skipped a beat. "Why are you here? Am I not allowed to be here?" Ken asked coldly. "Or maybe you should explain first why you reek of omega pheromones." Felix appeared out of nowhere. Hearing this, he raised an eyebrow playfully, looking like he was waiting for a good show. Ken shot him a glare, his face grim. Felix wiped the smile off his face, leaned in close to me, and tried to strike up a conversation. He stopped halfway, his expression suddenly changing. "The pheromones on you." He must have recognized his brother's scent. My palms started to sweat. I didn't know how to explain. Should I confess my illness? "Wesley." Before I could decide, Felix spoke softly. Beneath his calm voice, a monstrous rage seemed to be brewing. Ken took a step forward, blocking me. "Control your man." Felix threw the hateful words down and turned to leave. I was completely confused, unable to grasp the situation. But he was clearly going to find Wesley. Wesley was only helping me with treatment. I couldn't let him bear his brother's inexplicable anger. I tried to stop Felix, but Ken yanked me back with brute force. You can barely save yourself and you have time to worry about others? Back in the room, he pushed me, and I fell backward onto the bed. Ken looked down at me from above. The harsh white light hit his face, casting a shadow in his eyes. I felt a sudden chill and instinctively shrank back. But Ken snapped, grabbing my ankle and dragging me back, asking for a divorce. How dare you? He leaned over, closing in. An overwhelming wave of pheromones crashed into me. My head spun uncontrollably. Wait, I put a hand up to push him away. Don't come near me. My symptoms had just eased. I couldn't handle this stimulation. Ken pinned me to the bed again, gagged me with something, and gritted his teeth against my ear. You go behind my back to find an omega, but you won't let me touch you? If you can't accept an alpha, why did you provoke me in the first place? You like omegas, huh? Then I'll just have to work harder and turn you into my omega, won't I? I woke up from thirst. My head was splitting, and the gland at the back of my neck was hot and swollen. I instinctively reached up to touch it, stinging pain. I propped myself up, searching for the culprit. The next second, the sound of leather shoes striking the wooden floor echoed in the empty room. Top, top, top. Like a hammer hitting my heart. My heart, already pounding, trembled in fear. The sound approached leisurely like a predator toying with caged prey. Ken walked to the bedside, his dark mood from last night gone. He considerately brought a glass of water to my lips, smiling gently. Thirsty? Here, let me feed you. No need. I can do it myself. My voice was hoarse as I instinctively refused his service. Ken's eyes darkened. He dodged my hand. I said, I'll feed you. This time, he didn't wait for me to drink. He forced the rim of the glass between my lips and poured the water in. I couldn't swallow fast enough. Water dripped down my chin, soaking the front of my shirt. What a pity. Wasted. The phrase overlapped with a fragment from last night. My face instantly burned hot. The glass was moved away. Before I could catch my breath, my hair was yanked back, forcing my head up. My lower lip was bitten hard, almost drawing blood, but released just as quickly. I groaned in pain and pushed him away in anger. Ken paused, sat up straight, and returned to his calm, proper demeanor. He apologized. I lost control last night. Alphas really shouldn't defy nature and force a bond. My dry throat felt better after the water. I asked hoarsely, what? The divorce you proposed, I agree. Ken looked down at me, delivering the verdict. After last night, he had confirmed that alphas were naturally incompatible. Now he was calmly preparing to walk away. My heart was a barren wasteland. I couldn't stop shaking, but my voice was resolute. Good. Remember to sign. He decided to leave not because he loved Felix. What stood between us was the uncrossable chasm of being fellow alphas. I was powerless to fix it, and I didn't want to anymore. Let it end here. My mind was clear, but I still didn't dare look up at his retreating back. The expected sound of the door closing didn't come. I looked up, tears falling unexpectedly. Ken cupped my face, his cool fingertips brushing over my swollen eyelids. Why are you crying? Before I could get a word out, the phone rang. The screen showed Chris. I propped myself up to reach for it, but Ken snatched the phone away first. I was anxious. Chris definitely called me a dozen times last night. If I don't answer, he'll worry. Ken looked down at me, his tone matter-of-fact. I'll contact him for you. Don't. Worried Chris would tell Ken about my illness. I tried to stop him, but a chain around my ankle held me back. I could only watch helplessly as Ken took my phone and walked out the door. Only then did I realize there was a collar with an iron chain around my ankle, the other end secured to the bed frame. No wonder he didn't leave after agreeing to the divorce. From the start, he intended to chain me to his side. But why? My body, exhausted from last night, was running on fumes. I had only been holding on by sheer will. Just as I was about to pass out again, Ken rushed back in, his refined face pale. He unlocked the shackle on my ankle, scooped me up in his arms, and strode out. I curled into his embrace, my mind getting fuzzier. Before I lost consciousness, it felt like Scalding drops of water landed on my face. My pheromone disorder was congenital. This meant that in this lifetime, my partner could only be a high-matching omega or a beta with no pheromones. Since I didn't have a partner before, the disease had laid dormant, undetected. It wasn't until my wedding night with Ken that it erupted. Coming home from the hospital checkup, I suggested sleeping in separate rooms. The disease meant I couldn't even handle low-matching omegas, let alone an alpha. I had thought about divorce, but with the capital just injected into the Lancaster business, instability wasn't an option. Plus, having used shameful methods to bind Ken to me for life, I felt despicable and didn't dare have any further presumptuous thoughts about him. So, for the first year of marriage, we lived in peace. Things changed in the second year. My symptoms inexplicably worsened. I couldn't find the cause back then. After waking up this time, Chris gave me the answer. Ken had been using pheromones to mess with me, which was why my condition flared up. Only then did I vaguely realize that those strange dreams had actually happened. You helped him out of kindness, and he almost killed you, Chris cursed angrily beside me. What kind of person is he? I listened in silence. I couldn't blame him entirely. He didn't know about my illness. But right or wrong, there was no one left to argue with. Since that day, Ken had disappeared. I asked everyone, but no one could find him. The day before the Fong family gala, I called Wesley. The phone rang for a long time before being picked up. I got straight to the point, telling him I couldn't pretend to be his partner for the gala. Okay. Wesley's voice was broken, hoarse beyond recognition. Good boy. A dominant male voice cut in, and the call disconnected. I put down the phone and rubbed my forehead, deciding not to think too deeply about what was happening between Wesley and Felix. 1 month later, returning from a hospital checkup, I found the missing Ken at my door. He grabbed my wrist. We need to talk. Inside, I asked, talk about what? How is your illness? His eyes were dull and defeated. I'm sorry. I didn't know you were sick. Can you forgive me? It's stable now. I looked down. I didn't tell you about the illness beforehand. The fault isn't entirely yours. Then his eyes lit up. But you were right. Two alphas shouldn't defy nature to be together. I interrupted him. Since you're back, just sign the divorce papers. His tone turned frantic. I was talking nonsense back then. I was just spiting you. I never thought about separating from you. But it's the truth, isn't it? You can't do this to me. The corners of his eyes turned red, his voice trembling. You can't abandon me. I stayed silent. As long as this disease existed, we could never love each other. Better to make a clean break now. Tears rolled down his face, and he lowered his head to wipe them. Following his movement, I noticed a band of white gauze wrapped around his neck. Why the gauze? I reached out to touch it. Ken flinched and scrambled back, but his tone became strangely calm and honest. Nothing. Just got my glands removed. The sentence hit like a thunderclap. I shivered violently. Why? Why would you do that? Was it to be with me? Paying such a huge price just to be with me. Only then did I realize his feelings for me. Ken acted like it was nothing, awkwardly changing the subject. Can we not divorce? Yeah. Clearly not expecting me to agree, he froze. You're not agreeing just because I removed my glands, are you? It was my own decision. You don't have to take responsibility. If you still hold a grudge, don't force yourself. Ken, acting completely out of character, rambled on. I smiled through my tears. No, I wasn't agreeing because he removed his glands. I was agreeing because he loved me. Because I love you. Those 3 words, spanning my entire youth, finally left my lips. Ken stammered, seeming not to know where to start. Usually so composed, he was now like a clumsy teenager experiencing first love, pitifully asking for confirmation. You're not lying to me, right? The tables had turned. The controller became the suitor. I gave him a definite answer, and his joy could not be contained. Ken's perspective marrying Sam Sterling, much like my family's financial crisis, was something that happened completely outside my plans. Honestly, I didn't recognize him at first. I didn't know why an alpha would want to marry me. I looked into his eyes and calmly asked for his reasons. He analyzed the pros and cons for me with perfect logic. Then he added one sentence. Call it a favor for a fellow alumnus. That's when I remembered him, the bookworm from high school who ranked right behind me, cared only about studying, but was undeniably beautiful. There were better partners to cooperate with, but meeting the sincerity in his eyes when he said those words, I nodded like I was possessed. I regretted it afterward, wondering how I could have lost my mind and agreed to marry another alpha. But since we were married, I had no intention of shirking my marital duties. I even felt a flutter in my heart, for the first time in over 20 years, when I saw him on our wedding night, dressed meticulously in a suit but with the tips of his ears blushing red. But that night, just as I wanted to take things further, he suddenly developed a high fever, his lips turning pale. I rushed him to the hospital and stayed with him until dawn. In the early morning, I got an emergency call from my assistant. Seeing his condition stabilize and recognizing that his doctor was his close friend, I left him in their care and rushed to the company. But that day, after dealing with work and returning home, he coldly announced he wanted separate rooms. I thought he just hadn't adapted to married life yet, so I agreed. But from then on, his attitude toward me grew increasingly distant. First, I felt frustrated, comforting myself that this was for the best. It would make the eventual divorce easier if we didn't catch feelings. But that seed of attraction planted at the start quietly took root in my heart. Every time I saw him, it grew stronger. For someone who didn't fall easily, once was enough to etch it into the soul. But I didn't know where to start. I could only work desperately, striving to balance our relationship, hoping he would see me as an equal. I kept a calm face, but my desire grew day by day, while he remained completely oblivious. My pathological possessiveness in this relationship grew worse. It was manageable at first, but after seeing him drink wine fed to him by a stranger's omega, it spiraled out of control. He provoked me first. He had to accept the consequences.